A woman kneels in red sand under a sandstone overhang and grinds an edge onto a stone. Back and forth, wet grit under her palms for hours. She is not chipping the stone. She is polishing it, and that is the whole point. Every other tool anyone makes in this world is made by breaking. Hers is made by wearing away. When she finishes, she has the oldest ground edge axe anyone will ever find anywhere on Earth, and then she sets it down in the sand, and the sand keeps it. 65,000 years later, a team of archaeologists digs it back out, or 50,000. That number is the argument, because here is what makes this site different from almost every other story we tell you on this channel. Usually the science lines up. Here it does not. The dirt says one thing, the blood says another. Two of the most trusted methods we have for reading the deep past look at the same question and give different answers, and they have been giving different answers for 9 years. This is the story of a rock shelter called Madjedbebe on Mirarr country in northern Australia. It is the story of the richest early human deposit in the country and one of the richest anywhere in the world. And it is the story of a disagreement that nobody has won, told honestly, which means we are going to tell you where the evidence is strong, where it is thin, and where the only correct answer is that we do not yet know. Start with the place, because the place is not a backdrop here. It belongs to people who are still living on it. Madjedbebe is a sandstone rock shelter at the foot of the Arnhem Land Escarpment in the Northern Territory, about 30 miles inland from the coast today, surrounded by Kakadu National Park. The country is Mirarr country. The Mirarr are the traditional owners, and everything that has ever been done at that shelter has been done because they allowed it. The site used to appear in the literature under another name, Malacananya II, which is what outsiders called it. It is Madjedbebe now, which is what it is actually called. The first hole in the ground goes in back in 1973, when an archaeologist named Johan Kaminga sinks a test pit and hits about 8 feet of deposit with stone tools running most of the way down. In 1988 and 89, another team comes back with a dating technique called thermoluminescence, and gets a result that lands somewhere around 50,000 years. That was already startling. It was also fragile because the work was never published as a full site report, and a single narrow shaft through soft sand is exactly the kind of evidence that invites doubt. For 25 years, that doubt sat there and grew. Which brings us to 2012 and 2015 and an archaeologist named Chris Clarkson. His team goes back to Madjedbebe to settle it, and the deal they make first matters as much as the dig itself. The excavation happens under an agreement negotiated with the Mirarr through the Gunjayami Aboriginal Corporation. Under that agreement, the Mirarr hold the veto. They control where the trenches go. They control what happens to everything that comes out of the ground and where it is kept. They have approval over what gets announced and when. Senior traditional owners work on the excavation, and 2 of them, May Nango and Jakuk Janjomer, appear as named authors on the scientific papers. It has been described as one of the strongest agreements ever negotiated in Australia between traditional owners and an archaeological team. That is not a courtesy paragraph at the end of a paper. It is the reason the dig was possible at all. The trench they open is small by the standards of the claims that come out of it, about 200 square feet of floor. They go down through more than 8 feet of sand, and they record as they go with an obsessiveness that becomes central to everything that follows. Every artifact big enough to matter gets shot in with a laser, its exact position in 3 dimensions written down before it is lifted. Around 11,000 objects and features are logged that way. Everything else goes through sieves, and in total the excavation pulls more than 100,000 artifacts out of that small square of sand. And when they plot those 11,000 points, the sand is not a soup. The artifacts fall into 3 dense bands with quieter sand between them, which is what you would expect if people camped here in pulses, left, and came back. The deepest and densest of those bands is the one this whole story hangs on. It sits at the bottom, roughly 8.5 feet down, and it holds something like 10,000 stone artifacts. It is not a scatter. It is not a handful of ambiguous rocks. It is a floor thick with the debris of people living. Set the dating fight aside for a few minutes, because whatever age you assign to that bottom band, what is in it is remarkable on its own terms. Start with the axes, because that is the headline nobody disputes. In that lowest phase, the excavation finds ground-edge hatchet heads. Complete ones, and the small resharpening flakes that come off an axe when someone maintains it, which is how you know the tool was not a one-off but part of a working kit. These are the earliest known ground-edge axes in the world, not the earliest in Australia, the earliest anywhere. That deserves a second, because it is easy to hear the word axe and picture something crude. A flaked tool is fast. You strike a core, you get a sharp edge, and you are done in minutes. A ground edge is the opposite of fast. You abrade the stone against another stone with sand and water for hours, sometimes across days. What you get for that investment is an edge that is tougher, blunter in cross-section, and far less likely to shatter when you swing it into wood. It is a tool for chopping and for working timber, and it represents a decision that most stone technologies never make, to trade a great deal of time now for a tool that lasts. Then the grinding stones. The site produces around 560 of them across its whole sequence, and about 100 of those get put under a microscope for residue and use-wear analysis. Of the ones studied closely, most were used on plants. A smaller set was used on pigment. A few were used to maintain other stone tools, and a handful show traces of animal tissue. Seed grinding shows up in the deepest phase, which makes these the earliest known seed grinding implements in Australia. Grinding seeds is not a small thing. It is a way of turning food that is otherwise almost useless to a human gut into flour, and it means somebody worked out the processing before anyone had any reason to expect it. And then the color. The deposit is full of ochre, not raw lumps sitting there by accident, but ochre with ground facets on it, pieces used like crayons, and ochre residue on the grinding stones. Somebody was making pigment in quantity, and the intensity of it rises and falls through the sequence in pulses, as though there were seasons or generations when painting mattered more. What we do not have is the art. Anything painted on the shelter wall 60,000 years ago is long gone. The rock art still visible at Madjedbebe, and there are over 1,000 recorded motifs, is mostly from the last 1,500 years or so. So we have the paint and the tools for making paint and no surviving picture. That gap is just the honest state of the evidence. There is one more detail from the pigment work that is genuinely strange. Some of the paint mixtures contain ground mica, a mineral that flashes and glitters. Somebody was crushing a reflective mineral and mixing it into their ochre deliberately to make the paint catch light. It is the earliest known use of a reflective additive in pigment anywhere. Whatever it was for, it was not utility. It was for how it looked. Put it together and the picture of that lowest layer is not a band of survivors scraping through. It is people with a specialized toolkit processing plant foods, working wood with ground stone, and making glittering paint in a landscape that at that time was cold and dry with the sea far away, well over 100 miles from where the shelter sits. Whatever the date turns out to be, this is one of the richest early human assemblages that has ever been excavated. That part is not in dispute by anybody. Now the number. And to understand the argument, you have to understand exactly what was measured, because the whole fight lives in that detail. Nobody dated the axe. Nobody dated the ochre. You cannot. Radiocarbon only works on things that were once alive, and it runs out of usable signal somewhere around 50,000 years, which is precisely the range this argument is fought in. Stone has no clock in it, so what the team dated was the sand the artifacts were sitting in. The method is called optically stimulated luminescence, and it is genuinely clever. Here is how it works. A grain of quartz sitting in the ground is being hit constantly by faint natural radiation from the sediment around it. That radiation knocks electrons loose inside the crystal, and some of them get stuck in flaws in the lattice. They accumulate steadily, like water filling a jar. The longer the grain sits buried, the more trapped charge it holds, and sunlight empties the jar. Expose that grain to daylight for a few seconds and the traps release. The count resets to 0. So if you can collect a grain without ever letting light touch it, take it into a dark lab, hit it with a laser and measure the light it gives back, you can calculate how much charge it had stored. Divide that by how fast the local radiation is delivering the dose, and you get an answer to a very specific question. How long has it been since this individual grain of sand last saw the sun? That is the number, not how old the tool is, how long the sand has been in the dark. And the crucial refinement at Madjedbebe is that the dating was done grain by grain. Older luminescence work measured whole samples at once, thousands of grains mashed into a single average. An average hides everything interesting. If a few young grains have worked their way down into an old layer, or a few ancient grains have been kicked up from below, a bulk measurement quietly blends them and hands you a smooth wrong answer. Single grain dating measures each grain separately and gives you a whole distribution. And that distribution is diagnostic. If a layer has been churned, you see it, the ages spread out wide and messy. If the layer has been sitting undisturbed since it was deposited, the grains cluster tightly around one value. At Madjedbebe, the grains in the key layers cluster. The team ran dozens of luminescence samples through the sequence, along with more than 20 radiocarbon dates in the younger part of the deposit, and the two methods agree with each other as far back as radiocarbon can reach. That agreement is the load-bearing argument. If your luminescence chronology tracks radiocarbon accurately for 40,000 years, the reasoning goes, you have some right to trust it where radiocarbon can no longer follow. 4 samples were also sent to an independent lab at a different university and came back consistent. The headline figure the team published in 2017 is 65,000 years, plus or minus about 6,000. Read that error bar. It is not a precise claim. It is a claim that the start of occupation falls somewhere in a window running from roughly 59 to roughly 71,000 years ago. The published paper is careful in its own wording. Occupation begins by around 65,000 years ago and at least by 50,000. The deepest occupation phase as a whole is bracketed between roughly 69 and 50,000 years. That is the real shape of the archaeological claim, and it is a good deal more modest than the round number that went around the world. The critics do not attack the physics. That is the first thing to understand about this argument. Nobody serious says the luminescence lab got the sand wrong. What they say is that the sand and the axe are two different objects and that the date belongs to the sand. The whole case against 65,000 years rests on one question. Could the artifacts have moved down through sediment that was already older than they were? The lead voices here are James O'Connell and Jim Allen, two archaeologists who have spent decades on exactly this problem, and who have moved their own estimate for the settling of Australia upward over the years, as evidence accumulated from around 40,000 to the mid-40s to around 47 or 48,000. In 2018, with the geologist Martin Williams, they published a review arguing that Madjedbebe's claim to be much older than 50,000 years is unlikely to hold up. Their case is not one objection, it is a stack of them. The deposit is unconsolidated sand, dry, loose, uncemented, in a tropical environment with a violent wet season. Water moves through sand. The termites move through sand, and in northern Australia they move a great deal of it, sorting particles as they go and sometimes concentrating stones into false lines that look convincingly like an occupation floor. People trample sand, and a small dense object sitting on a loose sandy surface has one direction it can go over tens of thousands of years, and that direction is down. The critics point out that the artifacts in the deepest layers skew small, which is what you would expect if fine material had filtered downward. They argue that a feature the excavators read as a dug pit is better explained as a natural runoff channel at the shelter's drip line, which matters because a pit is a human signature and a runoff channel is not. And a later paper argued that the radiocarbon and luminescence patterns at the site are also consistent with termite disturbance, not just with undisturbed burial. The excavators have answers, and the answers are not hand-waving. They found refits, pieces of the same stone, broken apart during knapping, recovered close together in the same layer. Refits are hard to fake. If a deposit had been churned badly, Matching fragments would be scattered vertically, not sitting near each other. They ran a trampling experiment in the actual sediments at the site, walking artifacts into the sand and measuring how far they moved, and the displacement they recorded was on the order of a few inches, not the several feet the critic's scenario needs. A separate geoarchaeological study looked specifically for the signature of termite stone lines at Madjedbebe and concluded it was not there. And the single-grain dose distributions in the key layers are tight, which is the strongest reply of all, because heavy mixing should show up in those distributions, and it does not. So that is the archaeology arguing with itself, and it is a genuinely close argument. Then there is the second clock, and it is the reason this never resolved. Read the genomes of living people, count the mutations that have accumulated since two populations split, and you can estimate when the split happened. Do that across the world and you get a picture of the out of Africa dispersal that most geneticists have been comfortable with for years. The ancestors of everyone living outside Africa today leave somewhere around 50 to 55,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australians and Papuans branch off from other Eurasian populations, by one major 2016 estimate, somewhere in a window of roughly 51 to 72,000 years ago, and the arrival in Australia has generally been placed near the young end of that. There is one piece of that argument worth spelling out, because it does not depend on mutation rates at all. A man died in western Siberia about 43 to 45,000 years ago, and his genome survived. He carried Neanderthal ancestry, and in his DNA those Neanderthal stretches sit in long, unbroken blocks. Every generation, recombination chops inherited blocks shorter. Long blocks mean the interbreeding was recent. His blocks are long enough that the mixing with Neanderthals happened only a handful of millennia before he lived, which means the modern human expansion into Eurasia cannot have been running for very long before that. Push the out of Africa dispersal back to 65,000 years, and that block length gets hard to explain. That is the collision laid out plainly. The sand under the axes says one thing. The genomes of living people say something else. Both are careful science done by serious people, and they cannot both be straightforwardly right. Either the artifacts moved down through the sand, or the molecular clock is running too fast, or there was an early group in Australia who left tools but left no detectable genetic trace in anyone alive today. Any of those is possible. Nobody has demonstrated which. Something moved in 2025, and it moved from the direction nobody expected. A team working on mitochondrial DNA published a reanalysis built on more than 2,400 mitochondrial genomes from indigenous Australians and New Guineans. Their central move was technical, and it was aimed straight at the weakest joint in the genetic argument, the assumption that mutations accumulate at a steady rate. They do not. Over long timescales, slightly harmful mutations get weeded out, which makes deep splits look more recent than they really are. The team built a correction for that effect, calibrated against populations whose settlement dates are independently known. Their corrected estimate for people reaching Australia and New Guinea is around 60,000 years ago. That is not the 50,000 the genetic side had been defending. It is not 65,000 either. It is in between, and it narrows a gap that had looked immovable. The same work argues for two separate dispersal routes into the region and for deliberate seafaring rather than accidental drift, which is its own remarkable claim, because getting to Australia required open water crossings no matter which way you came. And the caveat arrived immediately from other geneticists. The correction is a model. The underlying rate uncertainty has not gone away. One paper does not close a 9-year argument, so where does that leave the number? Roughly here. The archaeology at Madjedbebe points to 65,000 with an error bar that reaches down to about 59. The genetics corrected points to about 60 and reaches up. Those two ranges now touch, which they did not in 2018. Serious researchers still land in different places. One prominent archaeologist put it about as fairly as it can be put. The evidence persuades him people were there by 60,000 years. They could be there earlier, and the specific figure of 65,000 is optimistic. That is not a fudge. That is what a correct answer looks like while an argument is still live. And here is the part that gets lost when a debate runs this long. The disputed thing is a number. The undisputed thing is everything else. The ground edge axes are the oldest known in the world, and no critic disputes that. Move the whole site down to 50,000 years, the youngest date anyone seriously proposes, and they are still the oldest ground edge axes ever found. The earliest seed grinding in Australia is still there. The reflective pigment is still there. More than 100,000 artifacts out of one small square of sand is still one of the richest early records anywhere on Earth. Whichever end of the range you take, the people at Madjedbebe were doing things earlier and better than the standard story of early modern humans had room for. There is a version of this story where the dispute is embarrassing, where science looks bad for failing to agree. That reading is exactly backwards. Two independent methods developed by different disciplines for different reasons were pointed at the same question and returned different answers, and instead of quietly splitting the difference, people spent 9 years attacking each other's assumptions in public. Out of that came a trampling experiment, a termite study, a reanalysis of the disputed pit, and a rebuilt molecular clock. The disagreement is the mechanism. It is what the whole apparatus is for. Taru is our invention. We gave her a name because it is easier to watch one person grind an edge onto a stone than to watch a statistic. The real person is unrecoverable. We do not know her name, whether she was a woman, what language she spoke, or what she thought the paint was for. What we have is the axe, the grindstone, the ochre with the glitter mixed into it, and 8.5 feet of sand that held all of it steady while the world changed shape overhead. The Mirarr are still there. The shelter sits on their country, closed to the public, managed by them. Their permission is the only reason anyone knows any of this, and their veto is why the work was done the way it was done. In 2024, the mining lease that had hung over the surrounding country for decades expired without being renewed, and the plan now is for that land to be folded into Kakadu National Park. The most argued over date in Australian archaeology sits on land that was never given up. 65,000 years or 60 or 50. This gets settled by somebody digging another site or by someone finding a way to date the artifact instead of the sand around it. Until then, the correct answer is a range, and saying so out loud is not weakness. Someone knelt under that overhang and ground an edge onto a stone for hours because she had decided that a tool should last. It outlasted her by a stretch of time we still